Hello and welcome to the FinTech Finance Virtual Arena. I'm your host, Doug Mackenzie, and on today's session, we're going to be looking all at cloud operational efficiencies and technology. And joining me today is Jonas Ng from Maybank. Jonas, how are you doing here today?
I'm great, Doug. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me. It's a fascinating topic, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about it with you.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you on, and with such experience, I'm so excited to hear more about what you've been working on at Maybank and also the industry as a whole. Now, with that in mind, I think the best way to kick things off is to look at what are some of the opportunities for financial services organizations to adopt cloud systems, and maybe look at why some of the traditional players have been slow to do so.
Sure. So by ways of introduction, perhaps for your audience, I work at KeyBank, which is a regional bank in the United States. We operate our retail and branch operations in only 17 of the 50 states. So by all definitions, we pretty much can consider ourselves a fairly traditional bank. We've been around for more than 100 years, so on. To give you some comparative context, as of 2020, there's between 5,000 and 8,000 U.S. banks. And the top 100 control $14.5 trillion in assets. But the top 4 banks in the United States actually control about half. KeyBank is ranked number 20, give or take, based upon deposit size. So that gives you a relative sense of size and where we are in the U.S. market. We have about $140 billion in total deposits. So to answer your question, I've seen really over the last 10, maybe 12 years, a gradual shift over to a lot more cloud computing that has picked up the pace in the last maybe 3-4 years or so. And I've seen that in the markets that we play in. I've seen it with some of our larger competitors, as well as even some of the smaller ones as well.
Incredible. Now, with that in mind, seeing that the industry has kind of actually started moving on to this tech, then, I know every organization is going to have different reasons for starting this journey, but is it fair to say that maybe scalability in today's climate is the key KPI behind using cloud in finance?
Yeah, I think so. I think the answer is yes. So I can recall back to about 10, 12 years ago when I first started seeing banks and traditional FI start to dabble around with cloud. I mean, it was still massive. It was still very early days for Amazon's AWS and Microsoft Azure. And my earliest recollections, going back nearly a decade, were that it was very kind of lightly dabbling into what cloud computing could do. We were starting to experiment with cloud, but really in very innocuous use cases, things that were very low risk. Perhaps marketing, like digital marketing platforms and programmatic media. Actually, at the company that I was at, we were playing around with cloud computing and platform as a service just to see if it would make us faster with our software delivery and the agile delivery of software development methodologies that we were playing around with. We were really trying to get to weekly, if not daily, sprints and releases, and we thought cloud could actually help us. And at the time, we all kind of realized that cloud computing is very much about efficiency, right? It's about scale. The reality was that maintaining hardware and software for software and developing new applications and distributed applications and so on, it just requires a lot of manpower, a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of investment. And cloud computing was trying to do all of that at scale. And very, very simply, banks would no longer have to divert our own treasure, our own resources, our own expertise towards maintaining some of this apparatus and that infrastructure and really focusing on the things that mattered the most. For example, the things that were client-facing, the things that we made money on, and so on and so forth.
But I think that's absolutely incredible to hear. It's not often you hear that release schedule could have been brought down to a day. And that really highlights the strength of the technology that we're going to be talking about today. And now, with that in mind, over the last 2 years, the technology itself has changed, banks have changed, the whole world has changed over the last 2 years. The pandemic has obviously come in and shifted how everything operates. So has cloud-based technology enabled financial institutions to grapple with the pandemic better in the States? And I'm also kind of interested, I want to lay on the top of that, if the pandemic had happened in 2008, would the financial institutions actually have managed to move and continue on as they did this time?
Yeah, Doug, I think it's a fascinating question. It's not one that I've actually thought about before. I think my guess would be that the answer is yes. Has cloud helped enable banks to be a bit more efficient, a bit more productive, frankly, just faster in the age of this pandemic? And the reason why I think the answer is yes is because, number one, banks have we've been forced to go to much more of a digital delivery model, right? Just by sheer necessity, actually, the rules in both of our countries were that we were in lockdown, right? That we were not allowing customers to come into our physical brick and mortar. And we had to force those clients to use the non-branch, non-physical, physical presence channels, whether it be anything from the ATM machine and the drive-through window, all the way to our online and mobile banking. And just by sheer volume of new users being on all of our digital assets, digital properties, cloud was somewhat opportunistically in the right place at the right time. I mean, we had to scale up very, very, very quickly. There's another reason that kind of pops into my head, Doug, to answer your question. As there was all of this sea change in the way that customers were actually interacting with their banks, and they were adopting these new channels. I mean, quite frankly, these are customers that were resisting those channels for years, if not decades. I mean, KeyBank still had customers that were continuing to come into the branch, continuing to come into the physical brick and mortar, even though we had already enabled online banking and mobile banking and phone banking decades ago. And so one of the other things that I think was at play here, Doug, was that customers were actually having to embrace and adopt these new channels in ways that they had really kind of resisted for 10, 20, 30 years. And so there was actually a step change in customers' behavior. And that requires a lot of really just change management and, adoption of all of these different channels, all of these different digital technologies that we had enabled. And that we're talking about customer awareness, education, trial adoption, trial usage, and so on and so forth. So really kind of being in the cloud for a lot of banks and FIs in our countries probably helped enable all the things that are associated with not just building something and putting it out there and hoping customers actually know how to use those things. So I'll give you an example, Doug. Remote deposit capture. It's been around for maybe 20 years now at this point.
Yeah.
And, for the customers that were actually not using it prior to the pandemic, we actually had to stand up any number of capabilities and messaging and applications that actually would teach a customer, here's how you use your phone to deposit a check. We know that you can't come into the branch anymore, but we're going to have to walk you through this step by step. We also want to assure you it's perfectly safe. It is completely reliable. It's not that intimidating. You're going to love it. And so part of why I think cloud computing really kind of helped enable that is we have to really embrace a whole different parallel a set of way of interacting with the customer, just teaching them about the things that we already had built years before.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't mind me saying, this is almost slightly cheeky, but I assumed that the pandemic and the digital move would be the killer of the check and commercial payments over in the States. But lo and behold, the check still survives. And it's really quite impressive. But it just shows that the other technologies had been there. You were already at KeyBank leveraging them. And it's brilliant that the customers now had this opportunity to listen to these new technologies that you've been working on and really embrace that change. Now, speaking of customers embracing change and banks adopting new technologies, one thing that always stays on the mind for a bank, and I think it's fair to say, is mitigating risk. And you can bring in as much new technology as you want, but you do it in a regulated and safe way. That's because of things like fraud. Now, would you say that cloud-based systems are actually safer than on-prem solutions nowadays?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Doug, let me fully admit, I'm not an expert in cloud versus on-prem security. And I couldn't necessarily tell you which security posture is any more safe, more secure than the other.
Yeah.
From my vantage point, really as a consumer of those cloud services, my perspective is that yes, traditional banks have been typically pretty conservative. This is a lot of change in a relatively small amount of time. And banks have been willing to embrace things that make us more productive, and they make the customer experience more powerful, more frictionless, more user-friendly, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, banks are trusted they're trusted by customers with two of the most sensitive, most guarded things that any of us have as consumers: your data, especially your personal information data, and your money. And early on, the thought of relocating how we host, how we store either your data or your money to a third party, off-prem, vendor that was not under our direct control, not under our direct governance, was really, it's kind of absurd to a traditional bank, to a conservative bank. It was absurd to our management teams. It was probably absurd to regulators and so on. I think over the last 10 years, you've seen really a bit of a quickened evolution, though, as we've come to embrace the reality that, yes, we have very real dollars at risk. And yes, we were certainly very anxious, very apprehensive about relying actually upon a third party to actually do a lot of that hosting, a lot of that management for us. We started to realize that we're willing to give the keys to the server room over because of what we get out of that. And, to your question, I do think that a lot of it is about economies of scale. I think that, again, as I was mentioning before, it was about shifting our attention and our resources and our focus to the things that really mattered more. And spending quite a bit of money, in the companies I've worked at, quite literally tens of millions of dollars on server rooms, trying to keep server racks at the perfect temperature with 8 layers of security, with floors that were elevated from the actual floor, getting pretty massive amounts of bandwidth wired into those server rooms and so on and so forth. It just got to be a very labor-intensive, time-intensive process. And I think, quite frankly, at least in my experience, it's a constant battle to try and stay on top of all of the latest trends and the developments in security. What your question was about, Doug. Trying to make sure that you are, as a company, staying on top of all the latest developments around operations, hardware, encryption, data at rest, data in transit, tokenization, so on and so forth. I mean, that really was taking quite a bit of that of your attention span and our focus to just stay on top of all the latest types of things. And I think that any security leader at any of the traditional banks that you interact with, or those in your audience, we will all tell you that this is a war of attrition. Fraudsters are getting smarter every day. They're constantly looking for vulnerabilities and penetration testing, right? And at the end of the day, this is not something that is a one and done. It is an ongoing battle to try and maintain your security posture against an enemy that is always getting smarter on you every day of the week. And so, is cloud more secure than on-prem? Again, I'm not an expert. I actually don't know the answer to that. But I can tell you that just by sheer economies of scale and the fact that these cloud providers, this is all they do, all day long, day in and day out. This is what they concentrate on. This is what they focus on. My guess would be that if cloud providers are not better than on-prem in security right now, today, then I'm willing to guarantee they're going to be there soon, right? They're going to get there sooner or later, because it is really hard for individual companies with our own fairly finite resources on our own, in our little siloed environments, to constantly maintain or fight this battle. A cloud provider can do it on scale for tens of thousands of clients or even hundreds of thousands of users of those cloud services. So my guess is they're going to be better, if they're not already, than anything that we could do on-prem.
Now, I think that is really interesting, and it's such a if you don't mind me saying, it's a brilliantly humble way of looking at it, because banks can't be everything. They can't be, Amazon at the same time as being, a 100-year-old bank that has your customers, confidential details and their money at the same time. That's impossible for any organization to do. So to be able to look and cherry pick the best of both worlds, I think is an incredible viewpoint to have. And it means that I think your organization is probably going to move in the right direction. Now, speaking of that, do you think that the technology, if we can still keep hammering it home as this conversation will allow, has cloud enabled your organization to collaborate and partner more effectively, even during the fact that we're in a lockdown? You can't have the fintech founders come in for a kind of sandbox day to kind of learn what they do. Has it enabled people to just kind of seamlessly connect?
Yeah, I think that one's an interesting question as well. And I when I originally, had talked with you and your organization about this topic, I hadn't actually considered that it might have enabled partnerships to be better or faster or more productive and so on. In my experience, and I've been doing partnerships at various banks and financial institutions for almost 25 years now, I've seen a lot of evolution. Yeah. In the more recent years, I've seen cloud have an impact on that evolution. But a lot of traditional banks we're still relatively behind the times. I mean, I think a lot of traditional banks in the United States are still coming to embrace, APIs and microservices, right? Things, RESTful services even. Whether or not blockchain actually could potentially enable that in a faster way and so on and so forth. So we're relatively slow to embrace fast-moving technologies, but I do think it's an interesting question around whether or not it's enabled partnerships. From my vantage point, of course, I would always like to be faster. I think that the way that it has enabled things to move a little bit faster is not just necessarily opening up connectivity. I think that's kind of what you were alluding to, Doug, and I think that that's probably true. But I think that, if anything, you also touched upon this. It's it's been a cultural shift of mindset. It's really, in the recent 10 years, I've seen traditional banks, stodgy banks that have been around for 50, 100, 150 years, start to embrace partnerships just in general. And your comment that you just made, not a few moments ago, Doug, that banks have to realize that there are some things that we do really well, and there are plenty of things that we really don't. What do we do well? We are good at managing credit, right? We're really good at managing liquidity. We're good at providing options for customers to invest their money. We have reach, we have distribution, right? We have a branded footprint, we've got a geographic footprint, and so on. These are the things that we do well. We are sitting on a treasure trove of data. That's what we know how to do. We know how to get customers. We know how to manage their money. We know how to manage their data in a very secure way. And the reality is that cloud providers, the advent of cloud, has actually helped us really understand that we have to kind of give up on the things that are really not what we do best. Banking is, in and of itself, a scale business. It's a highly mature, highly competitive, highly governed industry. And until we all kind of realize that with scale, you have to focus on the things that you do best, the things that are your core strengths, and find ways to either rent, buy, or partner on the things that really are not your strength, not your core suits, then you're going to be fighting a multi-front war every day of your life. It is challenging, right? To get and keep your customers happy on so many different levels. You've got to find places where you can pick your bets and really focus on what you do the best.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and it always plays back to that scale game, doesn't it? It's the fact that if you effectively pick your battles correctly, then you can scale in a way that ultimately means, as you said at the very beginning, the most important things, your customer-facing operations are ultimately going to scale with your customers. Now, Jonas, I want to kind of dive down into what you've been working on a bit more. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the platforms you've been working on, like I believe is the advanced mortgage platform?
Sure. I have to be a little bit sensitive as to, the things that we can reveal. I can't, divulge too much information around things that are currently underway, but the mortgage platform is a perfect example of whether we're using cloud or really kind of third parties in hosted, off-prem types of solutions. And again, it really kind of it boomerangs back to the topic that we've been talking about, right, Doug? It is about scale, and it's about leveraging your strengths and working with partners that actually bring other things to the table. And I can tell you that at KeyBank, especially with mortgages, right? Mortgages are a very time-intensive, labor-intensive business. And historically, it could take customers anywhere between 20 and 120 days to get through that mortgage process. It is the biggest thing that customers will typically buy in their lifetime, and it is arguably the most enduring, the most arduous process that people usually have to go through, especially when it comes to their money and their banking. We are always having this constant debate about how to make that experience more frictionless, a little bit more user-friendly, faster even. And there are a number of things that we are looking at when in terms of cloud platforms about making parts of that mortgage process that much more efficient, that much more user-friendly, that much faster. I'll give you an example, right? Artificial intelligence or robotic process automation providers. There's a lot of documents that have to be ingested in the mortgage process here in the States. It is high variability, right? Every state may very well have its own sets of forms to confirm identity, to confirm that the seller actually owns the property. Do they have the right insurance? Do they have title to the home, and so on and so forth? And we're looking at cloud providers that actually do that with AI in a much, much faster, much leaner way that we could ever hope to accomplish. And this is the debate that we are always having amongst our senior leadership here at KeyBank. And it spans across the business and our information technology and digital. Are we going to build, or do we rent or buy or lease or partner or rent with an option to buy? Do we go with on-prem? Do we try to build it ourselves? Or do we go with a cloud provider, right, who is actually spends every waking minute doing some of these pieces of the process? Do we go with a hosted solution or an aggregator model that has access to data that we could never hope to have access to? We're going to process tens, if not hundreds of thousands of mortgages, but a cloud provider might very well be doing millions. And the whole nature of scale, especially with the things that I talked about, with the AI and machine learning and RPA, they're only as good as the models being trained and the data running through those ecosystems. So cloud providers not only have economies of scale with the technology, they also probably have economies of scale with the data. Their models, their AI is going to learn way faster than anything that we could ever hope to stand up by ourselves. And so this is the ongoing debate. Do we go with one provider for everything? Do we build it ourselves, or do we go for best-in-class pieces of a bigger solution? I'll give you another example. It's around analytics, right? So one of the first places that KeyBank has tried to invest into cloud solutions is around reporting and data and analytics and business intelligence. We have, as I mentioned before, just a treasure of data, an almost immeasurable amount of data. It's actually almost kind of unfathomable for me to even comprehend how much data we're sitting on.
Yeah.
But as every one of your audience members knows, with big data comes really big challenges. It's a monster to try and get your arms around. So historically, traditional banks have been trying to stand up and build, technology ecosystems to be able to just manage that data, to be able to move that data, to be able to synthesize and normalize and interpret that data, and so on and so forth. And it's required investments in technology that, frankly, in some cases, we barely even understand. Think Hadoop file clusters and file systems and Spark clusters. Yeah. I mean, trying to just keep talent in-house to even understand all of those types of things has been a bit uphill battle. And I think the point there, Doug, is that we started considering whether or not cloud providers might be the better path to go for analytics because, number one, they have economies of scale when it comes to just expertise. Number two, just the sheer raw horsepower, the computing horsepower that is needed to be able to churn out some of this analytics, some of this business intelligence. It was hard to do without continuing to invest in more hardware, more server space, more compute power, and so on and so forth. Cloud providers seem to have that at scale already because they're doing this for any number of providers. And so economies of scale when it comes to talent and expertise and subject matter, economies of scale when it comes to raw computing power, and then obviously just the ability to access anywhere and so on and so forth. That was one of the easiest kind of business cases to be made around whether or not cloud and scale with cloud providers is actually going to be worth our while. We were fighting an uphill battle for years and years and years, just trying to manage this data ecosystem, and trying to not have your data lake become a data swamp, but trying to be able to get your arms around.
More was it beanbags or table tennis things to attract that talent?
Exactly. Trying to have foosball tables and free lunches to be able to bring tech talent from all around the planet. That's really hard to do in Cleveland, Ohio, right? I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but at least here in the States, the war for technology talent and trying to bring things on-prem and in-house, it is just all out hand-to-hand combat out there, right? Everybody out there is competing for the same degree of science and engineering talent. And we're competing across industry. It's not just in banking and financial services, right? You go head-to-head with retail and CPGs and manufacturers as well. Everybody's looking for the same talent. So that's another potential argument for cloud. It's like, because they're at scale, I'm not trying to slog it out with every bank in my ecosystem fighting for that one guy, Doug, who actually knows how to do this stuff, right? So
I wish I did.
Right. Me too.
Exactly. And well, Jonas, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there in terms of this technology has filtered into not only showcasing that scale can be achieved, but also the way that partnerships in financial institutions are going to continue going forward. And as you said, the keys to the server room are effectively now open because you can now scale with those organizations that just focus on that one little thing to help your organization help your customers with everything. So I think that's really interesting to hear. And Jonas, I think we are coming up to time, but thank you so much for your insight. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. I hope you've enjoyed yourself as well.
Well, thanks very much for having me again, Doug. It was a pleasure to talk to you about it. Again, very exciting topic that I'm sure we are all contemplating. I don't have any magic answers, but it is a fascinating discussion.
Exactly, and you know what, I think just by in the next 5 or so years we're going to see a very different landscape. So Jonas, thank you so much for your insights, and also to our audience as well. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over ffnews.com, and of course YouTube, and especially LinkedIn, where I'll see you in the comments. And for everyone, have a lovely day and goodbye.